Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. I mentioned in the first hour of this program that studying the Bible made me Catholic. Truly, studying the Scriptures made me Catholic, and I did a commentary to that effect. But that is a prelude to what I will be talking about on Catholic Answers Live today. I want to invite all of you to listen in, join in. I'd love to hear from you, hear your questions and insights. We'll be talking really about the Scriptures and how the theology of the covenants, the concept of the covenants, unveiled the Scriptures to me like never before. And it really has become my life. It's become the lens through which I read the Scriptures and thereby think about everything: the world, my marriage, family, my faith, politics, economics, science. Everything bears the divine imprint because it is all bound up in the reality that creation is a stage for the sake of the covenant that God had in store for all mankind. And the premise behind this is that when people tell you Christianity is about a personal relationship, an intimate relationship, it's about identity, connection, whatever the theme is, the fact is all of those are lacking terms. I'm going to be very honest here because the Scriptures utilize a much deeper language, and that's the language of covenant, the language that God has vowed himself to us and invited us into this shared exchange of lives, this vowed exchange of lives for the purpose of becoming family. The uncreated, eternal creator God has invited his finite, aveternal, created man into an everlasting bond of familial kinship with him, to truly become, in the language of the Scriptures, adopted, not just legally, but truly, and therefore heirs to the kingdom that is his, that's rightly his. And that's how the Scriptures were opened up to me. And so I want to invite all of us to dive deeper into that mystery. We're also going to be talking about the gospel readings today with Rob Corzine. And then finally, we speak with Travis Curtwright about the wondrous heritage of Thomas More and what we can learn from him theologically to this day. All this after the headlines.
Thanks, Marcus, and good afternoon, everybody. This is your Ave Maria Radio News for Friday, July 18th. It's the Feast of St. Camillus. And today's news is brought to you by the Ave Maria Family of Funds at AveMariaFunds.com. Pope Leo received a phone call today from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, following yesterday's Israeli army attack on Holy Family Catholic Church in Gaza. The attack killed 3 people and left several others injured, some of them seriously. During the conversation, the Holy Father renewed his call for the urgency of a ceasefire. Israeli Defense Forces stated that, quote, fragments of a projectile fired during a military operation mistakenly hit the church, end quote, and that the cause of the incident is under investigation. A federal court has blocked a Washington state law that would require priests to violate the seal of the confessional. The law added clergy to the list of mandatory abuse reporters in the state, but did not include an exemption for information learned in the confessional, explicitly leaving priests out of a privileged communication exception afforded to other professionals. In the ruling, District Judge David Estudio said there was no question that the law burdened the free exercise of religion. An explosion at an L.A. County Sheriff's Department compound has reportedly killed 3 sheriff's deputies. It happened just after 7:30 local time this morning in East L.A. ABC 7 says it looks like something exploded next to a bomb squad vehicle at a training facility. Fire crews are on the scene, and there are concerns that there may be some unexploded police devices on site. The first of what could be many Doge spending cuts are headed to President Trump's desk for his signature. Lawmakers voted 216 to 213 to approve the package of $9 billion in cuts to public broadcasting, global health programs, and foreign aid. This was after Republican senators narrowly passed the package yesterday. CBS is pulling the plug on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. The new network says its final show will be in May. Colbert, who's hosted the show since 2015, says he just learned the news Wednesday night. The network says it's purely a financial decision and not related to the show's performance, content, or other matters happening at Paramount. With your AveMariaRadio.net news, this is Brian Shalin.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. In this Sunday's Gospel, we hear the famous story of Martha and Mary. How does it connect to the story of the angels visiting Abraham? Rob Corzine joins us as we unpack the readings today. Rob is the Vice President of Programs for the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. Rob, thank you once again for making the time. How are you?
It is wonderful to be here. I'm a little exhausted. It was all week with 221 priests at our priest conference. But if I got anything left in the tank, this is what I want to do with it.
Well, we're honored and pleased. These are such rich and edifying sessions, and I'm really glad that you're making the time. So let's dive in.
So this Sunday, we have, as you said, we have Jesus visiting the home of Martha and Mary. But both the first reading and the gospel feature human beings hosting a meal for God. Abraham for the Lord in the first reading, and then Martha and Mary for Jesus in the gospel. And it raises the question, is it really possible for us to, quote-unquote, do God a favor by giving him a nice meal? And I think what we discover is that while God graciously accepts our services, and it's good for us to give them, it's really about what God does for us, not what we can do for him. So in the first reading, in Genesis 18, we hear, "The Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinth of Mamre, as he sat in the entrance of his tent while the day was growing hot. Looking up, Abraham saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, 'Sir, if I may ask you this favor, please do not go past your servant. Let some water be brought that you may bathe your feet, and then rest yourselves under the tree, now that you have come this close to your servant. Let me bring you a little food that you may refresh yourselves, and afterward you may go on your way.' The men replied, 'Very well, do as you have said.' Abraham hastened into the tent and told Sarah, 'Quick, 3 measures of fine flour, knead it and make rolls.' He ran to the herd, picked out a tender, choice steer, and gave it to a servant who quickly prepared it. Then Abraham got some curds and milk as well as the steer that had been prepared, and set these before the 3 men, and he waited on them under the tree while they ate. They asked Abraham, 'Where is your wife Sarah?' He replied, 'There in the tent.' One of them said, 'I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son.'" This is a very beautiful and mysterious narrative, and this has always suggested, in the Christian tradition, a mystical appearance of the Holy Trinity. So you have countless icons that are taking their inspiration from this, and certainly there's a weird interplay of 1 and 3. So first, the Lord, singular, appeared to Abraham, but then 3 men show up. And then when Abraham greets the men in Hebrew, he begins by addressing them second person singular, you, and then switches to second person plural, y'all. And so are they 1 or 3? Yes, they're both. And then so there's sort of an echo of the Trinity there, right, even though it's not explicit. And the context of this meal is important. In the immediately preceding text in Genesis 17, God had remade his covenant with Abraham that was first made in Genesis 15, introduced some revised terms, such as having circumcision be the mark of the covenant. And he also incorporates the promise of kingship as a term of the covenant and specifies that Sarah, Abraham's first and should have been his only wife, is going to be the mother of that heir of the covenant. Now, in our present chapter, the Lord shows up to have a meal with Abraham. Meals are important covenant rituals. Rituals form unrelated persons into family members, and families eat together. So it's a sign of communion and a sign of relationship. And having formed this covenant with Abraham, the Lord now appears to share a family meal with him. And it's interesting. Abraham is eager to serve the Lord and to feed him or feed them well. And he doesn't say, let me do you a favor. He says, "Sir, if I may ask you this favor, please do not go on past your servant. So Abraham gets the right relationship of our service to God. It's a favor to us when God allows us to serve Him. But this meal is not really what Abraham can do for the Lord. These angelic visitors didn't really need material food. This meal is about what the Lord can do for Abraham.
Right.
In particular, provide him not just family communion, but a son and an heir in fulfillment of those covenant promises. So that's the first meal that we have in today's readings, and then we'll see the second one in the gospel. But the psalm ties in really, really well. Also, we have in the first reading and gospel, this idea of sharing intimate communion with God. The psalm reminds us what sort of persons we need to be if we're going to have this privilege of living in the presence of the Lord. The refrain, or the antiphon, he who does justice will live in the presence of the Lord. One who walks blamelessly and does justice, who thinks the truth in his heart and slanders not with his tongue, who harms not his fellow man nor takes up reproach against his neighbor, by whom the reprobate is despised, while he honors those who fear the Lord, who lends not his money at usury and accepts no bribe against the innocent. One who does these things shall never be disturbed. So that the peace that we have in living in the presence of the Lord is not just we shamble in just as we are. We need to allow him to make us and remake us into those who can live in the presence of the Lord. These rules, so to speak, are not meant as some kind of constraint on our lifestyle. They're the path to happiness. Can the man be truly happy who's committing injustice and believing falsehoods and slander and harming and criticizing those around him? It's not just a sort of arbitrary set of rules. You got to come up to snuff, or our Lord's not going to associate with you. Those rules are for our good.
Right.
It's a way of being the kind of people who live in the presence of the Lord, and then become a blessing. Right? We participate in blessing others in the way that God has blessed us.
Right.
So that ties the first reading of the psalm tie in tightly to the gospel. In the second reading, we're really in this Lectio Continua. We're kind of reading through the epistle to the Colossians, but it's a really beautiful and, again, a powerful and kind of hard to digest piece of Pauline theology from Colossians 1. He writes, "Brothers and sisters, now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ, on behalf of his body, which is the church, of which I am a minister, in accordance with God's stewardship given to me to bring to completion for you the word of God, the mystery hidden from ages and from generations past." That's all one sentence. And then his second said, right, "Now it has been manifested to his holy ones, by whom God chose to make known the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles. It is Christ in you, the hope for glory. It is he whom we proclaim, admonishing everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone perfect in Christ." You could spend a lot of time just preaching and unpacking that, discovering this passage amongst others, but this one in particular was a kind of a revolution for me. I grew up in a Protestant Baptist setting where the idea was that Jesus suffered on my behalf, so I don't have to suffer.
Right.
But Paul is saying, and we would be sad at our sufferings. That's the natural thing to do, is to be sad at your sufferings, to avoid them, to lament them. But Paul comes in and says, "I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I'm filling up what's lacking in the afflictions of Christ." That would have been theologically meaningless growing up, but the church has a way of helping us see the gospel in that.
My guest is Rob Corzine, and we are just unpacking the second reading for this Sunday and seeing the covenant themes of how God is speaking to us. So stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
When I heard other business owners say they finally found someone in the credit card industry they can trust, I wondered how he could help me. So when Mark from Schisler CPC offered to show me where all the money goes for credit card processing with a free analysis of my business, I jumped on it. He reviewed how the industry works, where we could save, and offered a no-contract guarantee on savings and excellent customer service. I'm saving thousands of dollars a year. Schisler CPC. Trust in them.
More information available on the Ave Maria website under Sponsor Business Directory.
Maybe you've been hearing a lot about the need to make a spiritual communion while participating from home in a live-streamed or broadcast Mass. Maybe you've even prayed the prayer of spiritual communion. Spiritual communion is a concept that goes all the way back to the 4th century. It flourished in the Eastern Church and gradually moved west. Spiritual communion stresses the transcendence of God, where we unite our desires, intentions, and loves with the holy sacrifice of the Mass and the consecration of the Eucharist at the altar. Jesus, I embrace you and unite myself wholly to you.
Hello, Steve Ray here from Footprints of God Pilgrimages. Want to celebrate some amazing anniversaries this year in France? We'll visit Normandy Beach to celebrate our heroic military for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Also, the 100th anniversary of the canonization of St. Therese of Lisieux. Join us this October for our Saints and Shrines of France and a visit to the newly renovated Notre Dame Cathedral.
Find the Ave Maria Radio travel tab at avemariaradio.net. The London Oratory Schola Cantorum, an acclaimed 40-voice boys choir from England, presents a free concert at Old St. Mary's Church in Greektown, Friday, July 18th at 7:30 p.m. They'll perform traditional liturgical music from Renaissance masters, including Victoria, and from England, Byrd and Taus, and a special tribute to Palestrina on the 500th anniversary of his birth. For more information, visit oldstmarysdetroit.com or call 313-961-8711.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm speaking with Rob Corzine of the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology about the readings this Sunday. And Rob, you had just started touching on and rounding off what we're learning from Paul's epistle to the Colossians this Sunday.
Yeah, this is so important, and it's a uniquely Catholic teaching, and it's uniquely practical, I think, because all of us are going to experience suffering. And that suffering can either be used or not used. And I think Fulton Sheen used to drive by hospitals and lament all of the wasted suffering. But I think the best way to get into this is to look at Thomas Aquinas' commentary on Colossians. He notes that this could be misinterpreted as teaching that the passion of Christ was not sufficient for our redemption, and that somehow the sufferings of the saints are added to complete it. But that has to be heretical, right? As we as Baptists would have said, the blood of Christ is sufficient to redeem many more people than there ever could be. But what St. Thomas says is that's not it. Rather, we should understand that Christ and the church are one mystical person whose head is Christ and whose body is all the just. For every just person is a member of his head, individually members, as it says in this reading in verse 27. We could say that Paul was completing the sufferings that were lacking even in his own flesh. For what was lacking was that just as Christ had suffered in his own body, so he should also suffer in Paul, his member, and in similar ways to others. So that we find that our sufferings united to the sufferings of Christ have a redemptive value, both for us and for others. And so it's not just salvation by faith alone. It's salvation by Christ, and we are transformed we are transformed by our baptism. But given that transformation by our baptism, our conformity to Christ, gives our sufferings this added value and power. And I think this is really important,
right?
Because we're going to suffer anyway, and we can have meaningless suffering, or we can really understand and make use of the suffering that we have as we offer it, on the cross with our Lord. And that brings us to the gospel. So again, we're at these meal scenes. We're in Luke 10. This is part of Jesus' march down to Jerusalem. And we read that Jesus entered a village where a woman whose name was Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary who sat beside the Lord at his feet, listening to him speak. Martha, burdened with much serving, came to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me by myself to do the serving? Tell her to help me. The Lord said to her in reply, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her. So Martha and Mary, we see, have different attitudes toward having Jesus in their home. Mary's concerned about what Jesus can give to her, and she sits soaking up his teaching. Martha is concerned with what she can do for Jesus, and she gets busy about serving the food. But does a guy who can multiply loaves to feed 5,000 really need, someone in the kitchen to bring him food? Martha here is not ill-intentioned, and Jesus doesn't really rebuke her. He treats her very gently. Mm-hmm. This repetition of her name, Martha, Martha, is a sign of affection and his love for her.
Right.
He understands her mindset. He knows her desire to serve is ultimately also an expression of love for him, even if it's misguided. You're anxious and worried about many things, but there is need of only one thing, the unum necessarium. Mm. So what is that one thing? What is that one necessary thing? Now, one suggestion that Bible scholars have put forward is that Martha was overdoing it. That what Jesus is saying, you're trying to serve me all of the dishes that you know and make a big splash, but one dish would have been fine. I think that's possibly, true, but Scriptures has layers of meaning, and on the deeper level, the one thing that's necessary is this communion with God.
Right.
And at the end, this is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing we will do and enjoy in eternity. Martha's great business causes her to lose communion with Jesus, to lose this opportunity. So busy serving, she's not spending any time with him. There is, I think, a lot for us here. And Mary seems to understand, instinctively that this is the case. That she sits at Jesus' feet. I think there's they deal with one thing. There's a common misunderstanding here that is easy to fall into, that it's just a contrast between the active life and the contemplative life. Mm-hmm. And that Jesus is saying the contemplative life is better. Now, we would agree that there is a certain superiority of the contemplative life to the active life, but Jesus is not rebuking the activity. No, he doesn't say, why are you taking so much trouble with the meal? What he says is, you're anxious and worried about many things. There's need of only one thing. You can actively serve the Lord, and many of us are called to actively serve the Lord in a single-minded and single-hearted way, where we're not anxious or worried about many things. We are sitting at his feet, seeking communion with him, and it looks really active. So it's not just the active life versus the contemplative life. It's an interior disposition to receive. That what we give to God is not our little contribution. Even the Council of Trent teaches, even our good works are the result of his prior gift. And we always need to keep that at the front. There's this really interesting Old Testament echo. After the Sinai covenant is solemnized in Exodus 24, mm-hmm. We see the leaders of Israel go up on Mount Sinai and they share a meal with God. Mm-hmm. They beheld God and ate and drank, and this is a really powerful image, to eat and drink in God's presence. But some ancient rabbis even, I think, get a better insight to this, and they interpret that as not they saw God and they ate and drank, but they looked at God, and in this way they ate and drank. In other words, the beatific vision was their sustenance. Wow. And I think we can apply this verse to Mary. While Martha is trying to prepare a physical meal, Mary beholds Jesus, and that is sustenance enough for her. So I think we can take this concept and meditate on it in our Eucharistic adoration, the way that he is feeding us. And in this Sunday, when we hear these words proclaimed at Mass, our own covenant meal with God present, we need to keep this in mind. Remember, the Mass is not something we do for God. It's not a meal that we host for God. The Mass is something that God does for us. Right. He's the host of the meal. We're not doing him a favor by showing up on Sunday and putting something in the collection plate. That adds nothing to God. It doesn't enhance his dignity or add anything to his power or glory. God is doing us this favor by hosting us this meal every Sunday, where he's offering himself to us as food in the most intimate act of communion possible or even imaginable. So Mass is not about what we do for God, but what God is doing for us and how he wants to empower us to then be transformed into his body, conform to his Son, so that we can go out and do redemptive things in the world, and sometimes things like suffering. So these all tie together. But, if we think of it that way, it changes the way that we behave, the way we act, the way we think about being at Mass. We can say no to the distractions and the demands that want us to think about other things or squeeze Mass in on the way to something more important. And we need to build our Sundays and indeed our lives around this sort of pillar of the Mass, of the Eucharist, that's both the source and the summit of the Christian life, as the Second Vatican Council says. And we need to just say no to the distractions and other demands and be like Mary, to soak in the presence and teaching of Jesus. Not that we aren't sometimes active and sometimes actively serving God in our activity, but it's always ordered to this receptivity. What we give out is not something from us, but something that we first receive. And to do that, we have to be contemplatives in the midst of the world.
It's a powerful exhortation. Thank you so much for everything, Robin. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
My guest has been Rob Corzine, Vice President of Programs for the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, unpacking the mysteries of this weekend's readings. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
I don't think we've replaced our siding since we moved in 20 years ago. But I'm sure it's still fine, right?
We better call Mighty Dog Roofing of Ann Arbor.
Damaged siding can cause mold buildup and weaken your home structure. Protect your family by calling local Catholics Dan and Mary Flanagan at Mighty Dog Roofing for a free inspection of your siding, roof, or windows. Mighty Dog Roofing, 734-224-4916. That's 734-224-4916.
You like pizza? Me too. And for that, we can thank our friend Tom Monahan. First, he starts with $900 and opens one pizza shop. Then it's worldwide, thousands of shops. But all this was just a warm-up for his greatest achievement yet. He built a university.
God inspired Tom to build up generations of men and women who have a hunger to reach the world for Christ. This place is Ave Maria University.
Visit avemaria.edu to see what's next.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcus Peter, host of Ave Maria in the Afternoon and Unveiling the Covenants. Ave Maria Radio has been at the forefront of dialoguing faith at the intersection of all things pertaining to human flourishing. We need your help. Our infrastructure is in urgent need of updating. We want to ask you to support us in the summer campaign. Every gift, no matter how big or small, will be useful to bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth. Thank you. You are broadcasting hope with us.
When the need for senior care arises, home is where the heart is. Visiting Angels provides home care for mom or dad up to 24 hours per day, including personal care, meals, and light housework. You may select your professional caregiver with Visiting Angels. More information at visitingangels.com or at 877-374-LIVE. That's 877-374-LIVE. Visiting Angels, America's choice in senior home care.
Ave Maria School of Law is the Roman Catholic law school in the United States. Consistently ranked in the Princeton Review as one of the best and most conservative law schools, as well as pre-law's most devout law school. Ave Maria School of Law provides a traditional legal education while emphasizing how the law intersects with the Catholic intellectual tradition and natural law philosophy. Ave Maria School of Law, Unabashedly Catholic, consistently excellent. For more information, visit avemarialaw.edu.
This program brought to you in part by Ave Maria, Florida, a big kind of small town where golf carts take you everywhere and there's always something fun around the corner. Discover championship golf, resort-style amenities, and a town center full of shopping and dining. With Ave Maria University and Ave Maria Catholic Church at its heart, it's a community full of connection and charm. More than 25 model homes are available for viewing. More information can be found at avemaria.com. That's avemaria.com.
No one should ever have to choose between feeding their family and keeping their heat on. Impossible questions like rent or diapers demand answers every day, likely in your very own neighborhood. But you can help. Hope Clinic partners with you to provide free medical, dental, food, and behavioral health care, all in Jesus' name. While others face impossible choices, your choice is an easy one. Partner with Hope Clinic today. Find out how at www.thehopeclinic.org.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Thomas More is known for refusing the oath of succession and remaining silent about his reasons for doing so. His writings in prison tell a different story, that even under the threat of execution, he waged a prolific and coded campaign in writing to rebuke Henry VIII's claim to be supreme head of the church in England. Joining me to talk about this is the author of a new book, Thomas More, Politics, Polemics, and Prison Writings. This is Travis Curtwright, Professor of Humanities and Literature at Ave Maria University. Travis, great to speak with you again. How are you?
I'm happy to be here.
So, I want to begin with a broad sweeping introduction to the person of Thomas More, the virtue that he exemplified, despite the fact that he had a close relationship with Henry VIII, and how that eventually cost him everything.
Well, he's known for his integrity, and it's a historical coincidence that he coined that word into the English language. So if you peruse the Oxford English Dictionary, it'll give you a genealogical account of how words came into English and who coined them. And so More, in this twist of fate, coined a term, integrity, for which he later became known. What does that mean? I guess he was a person of principle, and he remained constant to his principles, even during times of duress, even when it cost him his life.
And despite the fact, like you mentioned, the costing of his social stature and eventually his life, we saw a man who, in integrity, stood firm on the perennial teachings that he had been handed down. And I want to, from there, talk about his prison writings, his tower works, as you call them. Talk about the witness that he sought to put forth, despite the fact that he was eventually facing his own demise.
Well, I think that that's a big part of the story of this book. From Bolt's Man for All Seasons, most of your listeners will be familiar with the idea of a silent More. And the idea is that he didn't speak out against schism in England. And when you go through the prison writings of More, you can see, well, that's not the case.
Right.
So heretofore, his prison writings have been viewed in terms of martyr literature. So we see an author whose mind is solely and exclusively focused in on heaven and his departure from this world. But my book argues that that's a erroneous depiction of Thomas More. And, you know, for those of you who are familiar with John Paul II's promulgation of Thomas More as patron saint of statesmen, you know, you might think that a statesman is an ironical statesman if he's not standing up for something. And it would be odd for us to canonize More as a patron saint of statesmen if he was full of pusillanimity. He wouldn't speak his mind, or he was forever sort of running from the law and turning just to silence. So what I try and point out in this book is that, yes, he was silent insofar as it was a good legal defense. So underneath interrogation, for example, he didn't state his reasons for why he refused the oath of succession. But in his prison writings, he made it very clear that he thought that the Roman Catholic Church had to have what he called a common head, and that common head was the Pope of Rome. And so Henry couldn't make himself, if you like, the vicar of England. Henry, of course, couldn't dispense the sacraments, which is something that Fisher thought Henry would be able to do if he, the king, actually were the vicar of England. So he couldn't be head of the church and head of the state, Henry. Mm-hmm. He had to be the king, but not the head of the church. The Pope was the head of the church. And for that truth, More wrote thousands of words in his prison writings.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, he didn't say a lot to that effect in his interrogation. However, as you bring out in chapter 2 of your book, during his interrogation, he mentions that his whole study should be upon the Passion of Christ, and this becomes one of the foundational pillars for how he lived his life out before, but also his prison witness.
Yeah, so the Passion of Christ is the subject of two so-called tower works. Mm-hmm. The last one, the major work, is De Tristitiae, on the sadness of Christ, and that's the one where he proposes a historical allegory. So we have Judas, we have the apostles, and we have Christ, and More reflects upon that episode from the Passion and posits that the apostles who are sleepy, those who are supposed to be awake in the Garden of Gethsemane, but are dozing, those are the bishops in England. And they have fallen asleep because their minds despair of hope. And then the Judas figure is the sort of wide awake and alert betrayer. And those are the forces arrayed against the Catholic Church. And then there are governors, other Herods, for example, other Caesars that are at work in 1535 when More's writing, and those are symbols or allegorical figures for people like Cromwell and the king himself. But just on this point about how the gospel is an image of More's own times,
right.
He writes the contrast between Judas and the apostles, that this contrast presents a clear and sharp image, a sad and terrible view of what has happened through the ages from those times even to our own. And then he adds, why do not bishops contemplate in this scene their own sleepiness? Since they have succeeded in the place of apostles, would that they would reproduce their virtues just as eagerly as they embrace their authority and as faithfully as they display their sloth and sleepiness. So the bishops were the ones that kind of rolled over in the convocation of clergy and gave Henry his titles and his role as head of the church in England. And More saw that as a betrayal of the deposit of faith, but also, and curiously, a reenactment of the Passion in More's own times.
Right.
And if you just think about it, a schism would be a rupture in the mystical body of Christ.
Yep.
The church is the mystical body of Christ, if you like, and it's being crucified every time there's a schismatic rupture. And so More kind of drew the connection between schism and a re-crucifixion or a reenactment or a representation of Christ's death that was being done all over again in 1535.
Mm-hmm. And considering this, Travis, I invite you to also comment on, we know more about the De Tristia, on the sadness of Christ, but not as much on his treatise upon the Passion of Christ, wherein he makes a prolific defense for the Eucharist and Christ's real presence in the Eucharist.
Yeah, so More was an opponent of the sacramentarian heresy.
Yep.
The belief that there was no real presence in the body and blood of Christ, that it was a symbol. And this was a hot, controversial topic, and More was a polemical author who defended the Orthodox teaching on the real presence. So persons like William Tyndale and George Joy would say things like, well, Catholics can't determine when Christ is speaking seriously or when he's speaking metaphorically. So Christ says, I am the gate, and he doesn't mean literally that he's a gate, or but what does Christ mean when he says, I am the bread of life?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Are we supposed to take that literally, or isn't he just also speaking metaphorically?
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of wrangle over John 6, right? I'm the bread of life that comes down from heaven, but then later he says that my word is the bread of life. And so Protestants would say, that Catholics couldn't determine when Christ is speaking metaphorically, and of course Christ didn't mean that we were supposed to eat his flesh. And Moore said, well, how do you determine when somebody speaks with a metaphor? And the humanist mode of exegesis would be to look at the whole passage in context. So he returns to John chapter 6, and he says, well, if you read it in context, everybody, except for the 12, abandoned Christ because of this teaching.
Right.
And Christ could have come forward and said, hey, I'm just kidding. That was a metaphor. I'm really just talking about my words. But he never actually says that, and he's content to have them leave over this particular issue. And he asks Peter directly, do you want to leave too? And Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. And these words actually testify to the real presence in the Eucharist.
Yep. I'm talking with Dr. Travis Curtwright. He is a professor at Ave Maria University and the author of Thomas More, Politics, Polemics, and Prison Writings, published by Notre Dame Press. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
The Wine Palace in Livonia is a proud sponsor of Ave Maria Radio. The Wine Palace is a family-owned business for over 60 years where customers come in for a great service. The 9,000 square foot store includes a humidor, specialty wine room, and a rare and collectible spirits room. We have the largest selection of spirits in the state at the most competitive prices. Ask for one of the brothers, Cliff or Kelly, and thank them for their strong support of Catholic radio. Delivery is available. Please visit the Wine Palace at I-96 in Middlebelt or at winepalacemi.com.
Underwritten in part by the following nonprofit.
Are you paying high prices with a traditional health insurance company that pays for things that violate your conscience? There's an alternative available. Solidarity HealthShare is a community of faithful individuals and families that never share into immoral medical services, all while saving you money with prices starting as low as $85 per month for singles and $512 for families. Never fund another abortion with your healthcare dollars. Call 844-313-4999 to learn more.
Do you own popular index mutual funds or ETFs? If so, you're automatically own shares of companies that conflict with your moral beliefs. Ave Maria mutual funds are managed to conform to pro-life and pro-family values. Long-term investors can invest in the no-load Ave Maria mutual funds. The experienced professional portfolio managers make decisions based on investment fundamentals and pro-life values. You can learn more about Ave Maria mutual funds today at 866 Ave Maria or visit AveMariaFunds.com.
Looking for a retreat venue for your youth group, sports team, ministry, or staff event? St. Francis Retreat Center in DeWitt sits on a picturesque 95-acre property, complete with 3 large conference rooms, 2 chapels, 2 dining rooms with commercial kitchens, meeting spaces for smaller groups, overnight lodging, and a professional staff to make your event a success. Call 517-669-8321 or visit stfrancis.ws to book your event today.
Hi, I'm Dr. Marcus Peter. Ave Maria Radio spearheads the proclamation of the gospel into all areas of society and culture. And so we want to invite you to think about what Catholic radio means for you. Because our towers and our equipment need updating. And we want to ask you to think about the impact of Catholic radio and how your donations can help continue the propagation of the gospel for the salvation of souls to all who hear it. Thank you for joining us on this wondrous mission.
St. Therese once told her sister Celine that when we trust ourselves and not God, our soul becomes barren and incapable of virtue. Her remedy? External works of charity. We all try to do it on our own sometimes without asking for God's help. At St. Paul Evangelization, we suggest sharing the gospel with someone who needs it. Check out streetevangelization.com to find a team near you where you can share the love of Jesus. If there isn't one in your area yet, perhaps God is calling you to start a team in your city. To learn more, visit streetevangelization.com.
Hi, I'm Father Chris Alar of the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception. My new book, Understanding the Sacraments, unpacks the extraordinary gifts unique to the Catholic Church. Ever wonder why we baptize infants? Is confession in the Bible? And must wives be subordinate to their husbands? The answers to these more hot-button questions about the sacraments are on sale now from Marian Press at shopmercy.org. God bless you.
St. Joseph's Helpers provides minor home repairs free of charge to those most in need in our community, especially veterans and the elderly. Your business can help by donating funds, construction materials, and equipment, or even planning a volunteer workday for your staff. To schedule a conversation on ways your business can partner with St. Joseph's Helpers, Visit sjhelpers.org today. St. Joseph's Helpers, giving dignity, spreading hope.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm speaking with Dr. Travis Curtwright, author of the controversial Thomas More, Politics, Polemics, and Prison Writings. Travis, when we last left off, we had begun touching on the polemical brilliance, apologetic brilliance of his treatise upon the Passion of Christ. Aside from being a directly polemical work, what do you speculate was his intent, especially catechetically, for this treatise?
Well, More wanted to shape public opinion. And I think that's one of the reasons why we think of him as patron saint of statesmen. We're very cognizant of the fact that there are influencers, people in the media that shape how others think about particular issues. We do analyses of discourse communities and how they differ from one another and, what shapes them. And that's not new. We think of the invention of the printing press, for example, and it's not exactly the same thing as the invention of the Internet, but it is a new way in which information is consumed and information is spread, and information is spread more widely and more quickly than ever before. And so More was an early pioneer of the advantages of the printed word. The Rastell family were his printers. England was not known for their printing expertise, but More and the Rastell family pushed the envelope and developed it quite nicely. And so when heresy starts to circulate around the streets of London, More can respond in a timely way and in a way that can sort of pervade the educated discourse in London about this question of the sacrament and the real presence. And not only that, he distinguished between types of readers. So there were those who could read secretarial hand, a kind of early modern cursive. There were those who could read print and Tudor print. Early modern print typography was different from our lettering system. And then there were others who were so-called readers, but they were oral readers. That is to say, someone would read to them aloud, and then people would be auditors, and they would hear these books read aloud, and then that would be how they get their information. And so that's part of the reason why More is repetitious in some of his polemical works, but also in the Treatise on the Passion, he's giving instructions to readers and saying, hey, here's how you deliver these arguments about the Eucharist to others. And so he's waging a public relations campaign to sort of let parishioners in London know that the truth of the Catholic Church still stands, and they ought not to be perturbed or overly inquisitive about these sort of new ideas that are ostensibly disproving the real presence in the sacrament.
And like you've commented, there are numerous facets of appeal to his treatise on the Passion of the Christ, one of which is we can rightly look at it as somewhat devotional in its meditations.
That's right, too, because he goes through sacramental or salvation history and ties it to the sacrament of the Eucharist. So some interesting formulations are, he calls this the Eucharist the sacrament of liberty. Right? I've never heard that term phrase. Why is it the sacrament of liberty? Well, it's in a certain sense the way in which Christ frees us from sin, because it's a non-bloody reenactment of his actual sacrifice on the cross, which is the means by which we are saved from sin, his death on the cross. But then his real presence also helps us fight against sin. And so there's this sense that just as the Passover lamb was sacrificed to free the Israelites from the servitude of the Egyptians, so too we have this Eucharistic sacrifice, which frees us from the servitude of sin. And so More than wants to talk about living a Eucharistic life in terms of being free from sin. And I thought that was beautiful. He also is very clear that the Eucharist is the greatest sacrament of the Church. Right? So we don't actually spend a lot of time discussing the hierarchy of sacraments, for example. Maybe you prefer confession, and I like baptism. But More's like, no, it's not a preference. It's actual fact that the Eucharist is the summit of the sacraments. So yeah, it is devotional. He does have some curious formulations that sort of augment the glory of that particular sacrament.
Now, I'd like to shift gears a little to talk about his letter from prison to Alice Arlington. If you could just paint his intent in writing this correspondence.
Well, this is a curiosity of sorts because the letter is penned or signed ostensibly by Margaret Roper.
Right.
And Moore is a character in the letter. So the letter tells or gives a dialogue between Margaret Moore Roper, Thomas More's daughter, and Thomas More himself, while Thomas More is in the Tower of London, imprisoned for his refusal to take the oath in favor of the Act of Succession. And as they're conversing, Margaret is pushing for More to take the oath and come home, and More is arguing his own case for why he shouldn't take the oath. And there's an authorship controversy because some of us think that Thomas More is the organizer of this, and others think that the letter's reportorial, that Margaret is actually just sort of taking down what it is that her father said. Still others, like John Guy, for example, think that it's a shared composition, that More and his daughter are both writing it. But it is interesting because if you're thinking about Thomas More and the Tower, how would he get his arguments in defense of himself out of the Tower? His letters were under surveillance.
Yeah.
Cromwell would have been eager to capture any apology that More would have written. And the convenient fact that Margaret is the author of this letter, which just coincidentally happens to provide More's defense of himself for his refusal to take the oath, and then it can be circulated not just amongst More's family members, but also More's friends, and all those in England who were perturbed by Henry's new title and Henry's sort of war now against Roman Catholicism.
In his defense of himself, he presents it's really a kind of apologia pro vita sua, right? It's a presentation, a systematic presentation of why he is taking this path. And as you bring up, was he under pressure, perhaps from his own family, to go the way of King Henry VIII?
I think so. I don't think Lady Alice ever understood what Thomas More was doing, why he wouldn't come home. Margaret Roper was probably the family member with whom he was closest, and she was a genius in her own right, a fantastic scholar. And she would say things like, why don't you just say one thing but think another? So the kind of Jesuitical practice of equivocation that becomes more pervasive later, that Shakespeare gets a hold of in his famous play Macbeth. We see Margaret already proposing something like that. And More very much stood on his own, not just alone in the Tower. Of course, John Fisher was with him, but they were rarities, but also More stood separate from his family.
Can you talk about in his letter to Arlington, how he appeals to utopia and the dialogue that takes place, and how he treats the concept of counsel?
Well, yeah. In utopia, a debate over counsel is a function of what they call deliberative speech. There are arguments over whether or not it's noble to serve a king. And deliberative speech is about what one should do in the future. And the categories or commonplaces are honestas and utilitas. So is it noble to do this thing? Is it ignoble to do this thing? Is it useful to do this thing? Or is it somehow not beneficial? And More wants to make the argument in Utopia that it is worthwhile, it is noble to serve at court. And his interlocutor, Raphael Hythloday, he's a fictive character, sort of another part of More's own mind. It says it seems like it's ignoble and it's not useful. No one's going to listen to you if you're an honest man going to court. And you'll probably wind up contradicting yourself and becoming a hypocrite if you do go anyway. So the second and later dialogue between More and Margaret is not deliberative but forensic. So forensic is not about what you should do in the future, but it's about what happened in the past and whether or not one is guilty or innocent. And now the question was more guilty of obstinacy, a so-called failure to serve his king. So here we have this nice historical story. In Utopia, More is arguing for serving a king. And in this letter to Allington, we have the accusation that More didn't serve his king well. And so he's got to provide a defense of himself, as you said earlier. And so now, if you like, counsel becomes a question of conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Can you serve your king with conscience? And More didn't think he could. So integrity gets back into the equation, as we discussed at the top.
And that brings us, we have about a minute left, but that brings us to his meditations in the De Tristia and the exploration of the true martyr and the call to martyrdom that he willingly embraced.
Well, that's right. More cast himself as a fearful martyr. Mm-hmm. That is to say, he was one who was afraid to die for the Catholic Church because he was afraid of suffering. And he took solace in the fact that Christ himself was also a fearful martyr, if you like. He envisions Christ speaking to him, so More writes words that Christ speaks to Thomas More.
Mm-hmm.
And the passage is, "O faint of heart, take courage and do not despair. You are afraid, you are sad, you are stricken with weariness and dread of the torment with which you have been cruelly threatened. Trust me, I conquered the world, and yet I suffered immeasurably more fear. I was sadder, I was more afflicted with weariness, more horrified at the prospect of cruel suffering drawing eagerly near and nearer."
Thank you very much, Travis. That was Professor Travis Curtwright, Professor of Humanities and Literature at Ave Maria University and the author of the controversial Thomas More, Politics, Polemics, and Prison Writings. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus P.